Who among the following 18th century English poets committed suicide after years of living close to starvation as a struggling poet? Right? Is it A. Robert Burns? Is it B. Thomas Chatterton? Is it C. William Collins? Or is it D. Charlotte Smith? Right? Again, a trivia from literary history. It's the author Thomas Chatterton. Right? Who's this person? He's often regarded as the first romantic poet. Right? He died in 1770. So he wrote prior to Wordsworth and Coleridge and other people. But he's believed to be the first because the first inklings of romanticism were seen in his work. Right? He started writing when he was only 11 and he committed suicide at the tender age of 17 by drinking water mixed with arsenic, right? Because the situation was really bad. Nobody was publishing him. He was trying to get published, but due to starvation and not having enough money and not being able to keep himself to write, he committed suicide, right? Moving on. Which of the following best describes the role of revision in the writing process? Is it A. Revision is discrete phase of writing process that should occur after the initial drafting phase? B. Is it substantive revision should be finalized during the second draft phase of writing process? C. Revision is a recursive activity that may occur at any phase of the writing process? Or is it D. Substantive revision should occur primarily during the editing phase of the writing process? Right? So it's a question about writing, it's a question about process of, and it's a question that's already featured in the NET exam, right? So while you cannot trace back to the section from which it has come, but it's about a writing process and literature is about writing, so it's a question that could come, right? And it's not a very difficult question to tackle because if you write, and some of us do write because we've been exposed to such writing that it does inspire us to write as well, you know that revision while you're writing is a constant thing, right? It's not like you always have to write the entire thing once and then you go back and revise it. Even after you've written 2 paragraphs, even if you're writing a poem, even after you've written 2 stanzas, it's an activity that you can always go back to and revise again, right? So there is no fixed definition for revision. You can always, it's a constantly occurring activity and it can occur at any phase of your writing process, right? The answer here is going to be C. Moving on to the next question. Which philosophers does Dante encounter in limbo, the first circle of hell? Is it Socrates? Is it Aristotle? Is it Heraclitus? Is it Plato? And then there are the combinations that are given. So A is 1 and 2 are correct. So Socrates and Heraclitus. B, 1 and 4 are correct. So Socrates and Plato. C, which makes it Aristotle and Plato. And D, which makes it Socrates and Heraclitus, right? Little bit about Dante. Dante's Inferno. Actually, Dante's Divine Comedy. Divided into 3 parts, right? Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, right? Each having 33 cantos each. Question that has already been asked, and this is a question that we've already discussed also, right? It's a text written in Italian, more appropriately Tuscan, right? It's a text written in Tuscan, right? So in the first part, in the first circle of hell, which is being talked of, there are various philosophers that are encountered, right? Important among these are Socrates, Plato, there is Cicero, right? There is Cicero and then there is Seneca, right? So important philosophers that are encountered in the first circle are these 4. So Socrates, Plato, Cicero, Seneca. Important fact, again, it's a factual question. You must know, but you must know what are the important philosophers that are met. So your answer here becomes 1 and 4, which is the B option, right? Moving on. Which of the following statements is not a correct description? Not, again, always telling you how important the word not or which of these is not true is, because always the question paper always confuses you with these, and then there are too many questions you tend to forget. So which of the following is not a correct description of Pope's The Dunciad, right? Is it A, the Dunciad is an attack on bad writers and bad writing? B, it is a pessimistic commentary on the civilization of time? D, is it about the coronation of Theobald? D. It wishes to satirize Theobald only. Right, little bit about text. Alexander Pope. It's written, it had 3 editions, right? So it was written 3 times. The first one came out in 1728 and anonymously, right? It's largely written in iambic pentameter. It's largely written in, not entirely though. So what is the text about? So the text is about, so it's a little, again, a little literary history that we have to go back to. So there is this individual called L. Theobald, right, who mocked Pope after he'd edited certain works of William Shakespeare. Right, after Pope had edited some works of William Shakespeare to fit 18th century's interests, right? So L. Theobald critiqued him in his text called Shakespeare Restored, which was written by him in 1726. And how did Pope respond? Pope responded through the Dunciad, written in 1729. Right? So what is the text about? The text of it talks about Theobald in the text appears as Tybalt. Right? So very close to the actual name as well. So he appears as Tybalt, and he's the favorite son of goddess of dullness. Right? He's the favorite son. So Theobald is the favorite son of goddess of dullness, and he's about to get coronated. Right? So let's look at the options again. Is it an attack on bad writers and bad writings? Yes, because Tybalt is supposed to be a bad writer whose most important attribute is the dullness of his writing. Right? Is it a pessimistic commentary on the civilization? Yes, it is, because it does talk about how the authors and their wits have been eroded. Is it about coronation? Yes, it is again. And does it wish to satirize Theobald only? Now, whenever you get this, if it's talking about a literary text, and if you get a question where it says, does it satirize this thing only? Right? It's very unlikely that an author, when it's writing an entire text, would satirize only one thing. Right? There has to be, even if it's satirizing an individual, there has to be the society that's also satirized along with the individual. Right? So the only also sort of gives you an insight as to what the answer is going to be. So the answer here is D. Next question. The Fairy Queen is an epic celebration of code of what? It's an epic celebration of what? Right? So the codes are, is it of Queen Elizabeth? A. Is it B, of Irish nation? Is it 3, of the Roman Catholic Church? Or 4, is it of the Protestant faith? Right? So the correct combination, so is it 1 and 3? Is it Queen Elizabeth and Roman Catholic Church? Is it 1 and 2, which is Queen Elizabeth and Irish nation? Is it 1 and 4, which is Queen Elizabeth and Protestant faith? Or is it 2 and 3, which is your D option, which is the Irish nation or the Protestant faith? Right? So now, we've already discussed a kind of chronological order of the kings and queens that came, right? Right? So Fairy Queen, who's the author of, very important, Edmund Spenser. Right? The author of epic poem Fairy Queen. We've also done in one of the previous questions the book, the important attribute or the characteristic that the books represent and the character that represents that attribute. So that is also an important question for Fairy Queen, right? So Fairy Queen, Edmund Spenser's epic poem, was written at the time of Queen Elizabeth. Right? It was written at the time of Queen Elizabeth I, right? So obviously, there is also a character that represents Queen Elizabeth. So, Queen Elizabeth has to be the answer. So, your answer is either A, B and C. So, D is automatically crossed out, right? So, it is an epic celebration of Queen Elizabeth. Now, if you know anything about that reign, and I have already told you when I was discussing the chronological order of kings and queens, that before Elizabeth, there was a Queen Mary, right? Who's also known in history as Bloody Mary. Right? She's known as Bloody Mary because she ordered for a mass execution of Protestants, right? And then when Queen Elizabeth came, who was Protestant by faith, there was order that was restored. And because order was restored in the political and the religious domain, there was this era where Queen Elizabeth was ruling, is also known as the Golden Period of Literature. right? Right? So golden period of literature, Queen Elizabeth. Also Queen Elizabeth, after Queen Elizabeth, there was James Swan. So with Queen Elizabeth, the Tudor dynasty ended and Stuart dynasty started. So this is a question that has also appeared. Right? So Queen Elizabeth, golden period of literature, and this is the time where she's established that no more Protestants will be prosecuted, and they felt protected. So it was an environment of harmony, right? So Protestant faith, even if you don't know the text, if you know a little bit about her reign, you would know that it's a reign of Protestant faith. So a text would obviously talk of, if it's talking about Queen Elizabeth, it would also talk of the importance of the goodness of the Protestant faith, right? So your answer here becomes C. Next question then. Which of the following statements is not true of The Stranger by Camus? Who Camus? Albert Camus. Right, the text is also called The Outsider, so don't get confused if you see Outsider sometime. Right, it's called The Stranger or The Outsider. Very famous, extremely famous first line that I in fact happened to share with my class of students yesterday only. The first line is, today mother died, or maybe yesterday, I don't know. Already a question on it, right? So the very famous first line is, today mother died, or maybe yesterday, I don't know, right? Now Albert Camus, also the text Myth of Sisyphus, right, talks about the important propounder, important person associated with existentialism. Right? It's a very important person associated with existentialism. So the text also is an elaboration in a way of the theory of existentialism. So what is the theory of existentialism? The theory of existentialism is that your existence on earth, or your existence in your life here, is not going to make too much sense, right? It's not going to make too much sense because you're not really born with a purpose. As we are moving along, we are trying to understand and trying to work through life, right? But this doesn't mean that if life is meaningless, then what is the reason or what is the aspiration to live? Which he opposes. He says, although there is no fixed meaning to life, but our job here is to constantly create our own meanings, right? This is a brief idea about existentialism and how it separates itself from nihilism, right? So the options here are, again, not true is important, right? So the options here are, the title character Mishra, an Algerian who kills an Arab man. B. The story divided into two parts give Mishra's first-person narrative before and after the murder respectively. Is it C? It's a realistic novel true to the locale it depicts. Or D. The theme and the outlook of the novel are cited as examples of existentialism. Right? So these are the four options, and obviously it's not a realistic novel. It does not focus on the representation of the locale at all. What is it focusing on? It's focusing on the character. It's focusing on the interiority of the character. What is the character feeling? So the character, Mishra, is the title character. He doesn't understand, just for the rush of killing an individual, because he doesn't know what he wants to do in his life. So just for that rush, because he doesn't understand, there is an existential crisis that he's feeling. Why am I doing what am I doing? Right? Why? What is the reason behind this? Why am I doing certain things? Why am I not killing somebody? So in just that curiosity, he happens to give what will happen if I press that trigger, right? So just in that curiosity, he kills an Arab man. And while he's on a trial, he doesn't even show remorse, right? So it's a very different text, I would say, because the individual always feels like a stranger. And stranger to what? Stranger to understanding his own life, right? I do not understand my life. I am a stranger to myself, right? So which of these is not true? It's not a realistic novel. It does deal with a lot of interiority and interiority of the characters. It's not dealing with the locale that it's representing, right? Moving on. Which of the following novels does not belong to campus novelist group? Now I've already discussed, we had a question on David Lodge last time, right? And we were discussing his campus trilogy. So I'll repeat that again. He is a campus novelist. What is a campus novelist in the first place? The campus novelist is a novel whose main action is set around the campus, right? So the campus becomes a central setting of the novel. So the options that are given are A. Angus Wilson, B. David Lodge, C. Anthony Powell, or D. Malcolm Bradbury. right? So we've already discussed, like I said, David Lodge. So he is not again. So he is a campus novelist. He has a trilogy. It's called the Campus Trilogy. The 3 texts in his trilogy are Changing Places, whose subtitle is From a Tale of Two Cities. It's called A Tale of Two Campuses. Then there is Small World. And then there is Nice Work. And this is the chronological order also of his campus trilogy. Then there is Malcolm Bradbury, who's written People is Wrong and The History Man, which are 2 of his important campus novels. Then there is Angus Wilson, who's also written a campus novel. It's called The Anglo-Saxon Attitude. Dates are not too important for you, but remember the chronological order of David Lodge's campus trilogy. Right? So it's only Anthony Powell who's not written a campus novel. He's written a 12-volume work which is important. It's called The Dance to the Music of Time. So while Anthony Powell is not an author that is a campus novelist, but you must look at him as well because he's been featured in an option, and the text that he's written is a 12-volume text. It's called The Dance to the Music of Time. Right? Moving on to the next question. Laura Mulvey's pioneering essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, is an instance of feminist appropriation of psychoanalysis. It particularly uses Does it use A, Freud's concept of sublimation? Does it use Jung's concept of collective unconscious? Does it use Lacan's concept of gaze? Or does it use Lacan's notion of fragmented body? Right? Now it's a little complicated question, I understand, because Mulvey's text is not as important as some of the other texts are. But here I'm also going to teach you how to tackle the question if you don't have an idea about the question at all. So the question says visual pleasure and narrative cinema, right? It's talking about cinema and it's talking about the visual pleasure of cinema. Now, unconscious, sublimation, fragmented body could be options, but gaze is the most appropriate option immediately, right? So what is the idea of male gaze? The idea of male gaze for instance, that the film creates a space for female sexual, so the space of the film or the space of the movie, the cinema, creates a space of female objectification, sexual objectification. Right? And then the male viewer, it's almost like a voyeuristic experience of the male viewer sitting back and looking at the female sexualized object that is being represented, right? And it is in fact the answer. So Lacan's concept of gaze, which is precisely that, where it almost becomes like an exploitative activity where female are projected in a fashion that male want to see them in, right? And in that process, they are, it's almost a voyeuristic experience where her space is taken up, right? So this is the, C is the option here and C is the answer for you. Next question. In Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which character has 2 pages of unpunctuated speech? Is it Estragon? Is it B, Vladimir? Is it C, Lucky? Or is it D, Pozo? Right? So who in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, right, has unpunctuated 2-page speech? So the answer here is going to be Lucky. Now for Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, everything and every little detail is important. It's a small text. I would advise you, now there's no time, but otherwise I advise all my students to read the text only because it's an important text and highlight all the important factors also, right? So it's a unique play again. It's a play that's part of Theatre of Absurd, right? It's a part of that absurd theatre group, and it does talk of it. There's a lot of crisis in the text. There's a lot of existential crisis in the text, and there is a lot of play. So for all your Theatre of Absurd or absurdist theatre, there's a lot of play with language, right? So language has been presented in a certain fashion. There is a structure to language, but in absurdity is precisely that I don't know how to use my language, and what is the role of this language, and where do I fit in this idea of language? How important is language in the culture? Am I language or is language me? Right? So all these questions tend to make you break the structure of language. So in Beckett's, there is constantly tampering of language. They are saying things that don't make sense, and the audience is also trying to understand. And then there is a 2-page long unpunctuated speech where everything is let loose, right? There is no punctuation, there is no sense that you can make of it, and it's unpunctuated, and it's the breaking up point, right? So many people who read Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot see the text that comes before it and after it like modernism. And the point where it's breaking, the point where there is no punctuation also is seen as a celebration, right? And like we discussed, celebration, the point when you start celebrating there being no structure, what do you reach? What point do you reach? Do you reach the point of postmodern, right? So there is this part, but for, like I said, Waiting for Godot, everything is important and all details must be looked at. Moving on to the next question. These critics transcend the subjective point of view. They bow to other forms of objective authority. The authority of the past and the authority of social consciousness. They adopt the scientific attitude without science. The above formulation best describes A. Neoclassical critics, B. Romantic critics, D. The art for art's sake critics, or D. Symbolist critics, right? So the question says, they transcend subjective point of view, right? The subjective point of view is when I have a different point of view and you have a different point of view. Both our point of views can be different and there is an acceptance of this. But these critics have transcended that. So they can't be romantic, right? Because what do the romantic critics say? That looking at nature, everyone who looks at nature tends to look at nature in its own form, because everyone who looks at nature tends to go back and reflect upon their own experiences, the kind of experience that nature has inflicted upon them or has had upon them, right? So this is the romantics. So the romantics will never transcend subjective point of view. Okay? Then it says it bows down to objective authority. So it bows down to the fact that there is going to be a singular narratival authority, right? So that there is going to be a fixed structure that all of us have to follow. So what is the authority that they are following? They are following the authority of the past. Just this much gives you the idea that they are the neoclassical critics, also known as the Augustan critics. Because they did follow the authority of the past, the structure that was used in the past, and they did move on from there to talk about things that were important in their era, right? So your answer here becomes neoclassical critics who went back to the original forms, who went back to Aristotle, Plato, and tried to understand and try to use them in the present context that they were writing in, right? So this becomes your answer. So like I say always, we are going to post more videos. If you like the video, if you think that it was useful, follow the channel, right? Subscribe to it so that you can see more videos like that, which we are going to regularly post. Thank you.